Okay, so welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum, where we are in conversation today with two of my favourite Irish American authors. We've had Terry Golway many times with us here at the museum. He is a historian, an author, and a journalist, longtime editor with the New York Observer, but also with Politico, and has written several books about the Irish American experience, including, I think most importantly, Machine Made, which is Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics, Frank and Al, FDR, Al Smith, and the Unlikely Alliance that created the modern Democratic Party, and Heroes All, which we've had him give a talk about at the lecture too, which is about the New York Fire Department. And then, of course, Peter Quinn, who is one of my favourite authors. We met years ago at Fordham when he came to speak to the Institute of Irish Studies with Terry. He was a speechwriter for Governor Hugh Carey, continued on in various kind of government and political roles, and has written famous novels and collections of essays about the Irish American experience. Banished Children of Eve has won the American Book Award. Looking for Jimmy, In Search of Irish America, which is a collection of articles and non-fiction pieces, was published in 2007. His books, The Man Who Never Returned, Hour of the Cat, and Dry Bones, which was reviewed as generous and agile and profound, has kind of given, I think, voice to Irish America for the last 20 or 30 years. So we're delighted to have you in this Irish American Heritage Month, where we're just going to talk about all things Irish American, identity, history and politics, that kind of thing. So I suppose, Peter, if you want to kind of start us off, talk to me about how you came, first of all, to your Irish heritage.
Well, let me do a shameless self-promotion, which all writers. I wrote a memoir, which is going to be published by Fordham University Press in September. Cross Bronx, A Writing Life. So you really want to find out about me, read the book. I have a blurb from Golway too. I've never met, but it was very complimentary. And how I came to my Irish American heritage?
Mm-hmm. I suppose there was never a time you weren't aware of it. Is that right?
Yeah, I was, but I wasn't. I mean, growing up in the Bronx in the 50s, we thought of ourselves as Irish, but I didn't read Joyce. I never heard of Yeats, was Culholland, none. We were Catholic. That's what. We're Irish Catholics. That's our identity. I went through Catholic grammar school, high school, college. I never had a course in Irish history. St. Raymond's, Manhattan Prep, Manhattan College, but all founded by Irish religious teachers. Not once did any mention of Irish history ever come up. It wasn't until I was in college that I took a course on Victorian England, where the famine came up. Wow. And then I became so interested, I went to Fordham to work under Morris O'Connell, because he was Daniel O'Connell's great-grandson and was editing the O'Connell papers. And that's when I seriously began to look at Irish history. Mm-hmm. And forget Irish American history. We had no sense. I remember one thing reading Samuel Eliot Morrison's Oxford History of the American People. He was a WASP Bostonian. And he had two sentences on the Irish. He said, the famine Irish contributed nothing to American intellectual life and little to American economic life. Wow. So that's the kind of things that, right up into the 60s we're dealing with. Wow. And the Irish identity, we can get into this, is changing because of the fading influence of the Catholic Church, which was my whole life. We were surrounded by the church. That was our identity. And we were careful to keep, the church belonged to us, and the Italians went to our church. That was the feeling.
God, Terry, was it similar for you growing up, or were you aware you were growing up in an Irish American house?
Not really. In fact, Peter obviously is so much older than I, but there's an even bigger gap in our experience, and I think that might be the difference between literally just a decade, and also maybe the suburban experience. I grew up on Staten Island. My father's family, we actually don't know when they came here. The paper trail ran out in around the 1880s. My mother's father was an immigrant from Donegal. He died when I was fairly young. We knew that he didn't talk like we did, right? In retrospect, he had this Donegal accent, but it literally meant nothing. I also went to Catholic school. I was taught by Irish nuns, Sister Brendan. No mention. the project for Catholic schools back in the Cold War, particularly when the Cold War was at its hottest, was to assimilate, right? We were all, we were Americans, right? The hyphen came very close, I think, to being eradicated in that time. I had zero interest in what was going on in Northern Ireland in the late 60s and early 70s. Mind you, it was a bad time in the United States too. So to sort of think, well, you know, why don't I think about this other country? It would have never occurred to me. What got me interested in Irishness was the desperation of a journalist in search of a byline when the IRA killed Lord Mountbatten off the coast of Donegal in 1979. I said, "Oh, wow, isn't that interesting?" First of all, I knew who Lord Mountbatten was. Wasn't so sure about who the IRA was, but I wanted a story, and I thought, well, why don't I go out? You know, local journalists do this all the time, or back in the day when there were newspapers, you would say, "Oh, well, here's this major international story. Let's get the local angle." So I started calling Irish Americans on Staten Island, asking them, well, what do they think about the IRA killing this war hero, right? The guy who fought on our side during World War II. How could they have done such a thing? Well, one of my first calls was to my parish priest, Father Morris Burke, who I knew was Irish, but that was all I knew. Little did I know he was the chaplain for Irish Northern Aid, which at the time was considered to be an ally of Sinn Féin / IRA. So I got a tutorial in Irish history from Father Morris Burke. And I do remember going there. I was going to interview him, ostensibly about Lord Mountbatten. I had a tape recorder with me. And I started off by saying, Father Burke, how could the IRA have done this? And he literally started off by saying, well, I'm not going to attempt a Waterford accent. He said, well, Terry, you have to understand, in 1188 or whatever. And I looked at my tape recorder and I said, I don't think I have enough tape for this interview. But it was sort of like, a Sparks Note version of Irish history, obviously from a very Republican point of view. But that was where I got interested. I was hearing things I had never heard before. And, all these years later, it was because of that conversation that I'm even speaking to you today.
Elizabeth, after I published Looking for Jimmy, I got a letter from a woman in Virginia. She was my cousin. I didn't know it. She read the book. She picked it up in a bookstore, and she's a genealogist. So I found out I knew nothing about. I knew my family arrived around the time of the famine. They were on the Lower East Side. My great-grandmother had 5 children. Well, it turns out she had 10 children. Her name wasn't Manning, it was Mangan. I have 2 great aunts buried in Calvary Cemetery without headstones who died before the age of 2. 5 of her children died before their 20s. I knew none of this history. It was just, my grandmother was born at Fordham on April 18th, 1863, and baptized in the college church. It was St. John's College then, the day after. I knew none of that. It was all kind of forgotten. It was, my mother was always talking about excess baggage. You don't need, she had a line, if we have lost relatives, they were lost for a reason. And that was just the past. They were not looking to the past. It was all the American future. That's what we were oriented to becoming. And in the Bronx in the 50s, there were no Americans. We were Irish Catholic or Italians or Jewish. You knew your tribe. If somebody asked you what you were, you wouldn't say American. That's all changed now. My children grown up in the suburbs, they're first generation Americans, I think of them. Even before Manning was the name that came over, and we found out it's really Mangan. At some point, they changed it. There was a family that became before them in 1847, the Lees, and they lived in West Farms, and he was a cobbler. They had 8 children. I know nothing about them. I don't know where they are. It was this great scattering in the famine, which was never, and Irish will very much get on with the future, which is, kind of contra the popular image of the Irish obsessed with their past and never willing to let it go. Genealogy was not part of my family. If anything, it was about forgetting. It was 2 little children buried in Calvary Cemetery. The attitude was, what good is that to tell you that? It's just painful. And our object is put the pain behind us. And I have relatives that came in the famine. First time I ever really looked at the famine, I was a junior at Manhattan College. That was the whole reason for my family's existence here.
Yeah. I had a similar experience in Ireland when I was researching the famine. An old man in my hometown, who kind of, the information was going to die with him if he didn't share it, really, and I was trying to pull it from him, and he said, Gerline, why would you want to know that, and kind of just leave it in the past. And it was, you'd get these kind of little tidbits of crumbs, but I think you're right that there's an element of the Irish that don't like to speak about, maybe, there's a sense of hopelessness, maybe a helplessness, there was a lot they couldn't control. And then I think the grief that, maybe you were lucky to just have landed here, to be safe here and to be able to survive. I think I read one time that on average, the famine era immigrants lived for another 7 years once they got here. So even that tribe like that got off the boat must have had continued losses, when they came here, your own family, to lose those children. So maybe there was something to be said for just keeping on, and putting the best side out.
I call it the Olympics of victimhood. Who suffered more? In the 19th century, it was the opposite. Victimhood you wanted to get away from. It was like, descended from kings. Somebody went to Ireland, a relative, and brought back an ashtray with the Quinn coat of arms on it. We were like, what the hell is this? But this was, we were descended from kings. It wasn't we were poor, ignorant, abused peasants who, two of my great uncles died of alcoholism. That was not part of the family record. The genealogists got their death certificates.
So, and that's very interesting then, as Terry says, by the 70s, America is so troubled. I just watched a fantastic documentary on Apple TV called 1971, the year music changed the world, and it's all about Vietnam and Nixon and, Black Power movement starting up. America did have its hands full, and that was one of the things. The hyphen had been, quote unquote, under attack since before World War One. And then, all of this work that was being done, I guess, on roots, and there was this kind of drive to feel you belonged to something more, maybe after Vietnam. And, maybe America wasn't looking as kind of shiny and full of purpose, maybe, for people. And so there was this maybe connection with the past, or an imagined past.
I think I showed my generation of leaving it all behind.
Yeah.
And going into America. And that's when some of us turned around and said, what was that all about?
Yeah.
Where do we come from? I was a Vista volunteer in Kansas City in 1970, and my roommate was from California, and I was going to go to California with him to become a teacher. And it was the first time in my life I ever turned around and said, I don't really know much about where I come from, but I feel this pull of New York. That's what I felt. I was a New Yorker more than I was Irish. I was a New Yorker more than I was an American, actually.
Terry?
Yeah, I think also in the time that I was in grammar school in the 60s, we had passed a time that Pat Moynihan wrote about in Beyond the Melting Pot, where, after World War II and during the Cold War, all of a sudden, people from Harvard were being interviewed by people from Fordham, about their loyalties, So there was a sense of arrival, and it's a cliche, but I think it's a cliche for a reason. John F. Kennedy's election in 1960 seemed to be the end of the story. And for a long time it was, and I think we've had two spurts of interest in Irish stuff. Part of it was a result of the troubles in Northern Ireland, and people like myself became conscious of our past. And then we saw in the 90s, thanks to people like Bill Kennedy and Tom Cahill, and of course, Frank McCourt, we saw this, and Riverdance and Gene Butler, we saw this tremendous surge of interest in Irish stuff. And Peter and I have benefited from that because, most of our books are sort of from that period. But I wonder if that sort of, it's cool to be Irish period. I wonder if we're coming to the end of that and what then comes next. And I think, for example, people in the Irish government are very concerned about that. We've had this 25-year revival that seems to be sputtering at the moment. And a lot of it, I think, is related to what Peter put his finger on, as usual, just precisely about the loss of Catholic identity and what does that mean for Irish identity.
The Irish identity in America has kind of been a wave. When they first came, they were hated, they were outcasts. And then as other immigrant groups came in, they became the well-behaved. That's the model, everybody, the good cop, the kind priest. And then the movies did it, the Catholic Church leaned pretty heavily on Hollywood, and you had Bing Crosby and Ingrid Bergman, who's a Swedish nun, which kind of made an Irish baron. But they're the five Sullivan brothers, you know, the movie about that. And then in the 60s, they become the poster child for white bigots with the Boston. Then you have Joe, the movie Joe. Then you have Archie Bunker, who, of course, is really an Irish Catholic in Queens, played by Carol. The only Protestants in Queens were the Trumps, I think. And working class guy in a plaid shirt. He's, you know, everybody knows he's Irish. That's the secret. And now they're poster child for bigotry and white reaction. And then it kind of goes back again, as Terry was saying, with as the accent is on Irish culture and the religions kind of fades, become popular again. So, and now it's just become the dichotomy. The 1619 Project is just race. Everything in America is divided on race. Which so, you talked earlier about, you know, it is, this racism is baked into American history. You can't deny that, into law, institutions, but it's a bigger story than that.
Well, I think you've touched on something very important, and, you know, we generally try to stay away from politics in the museum, but, you know, I think that Irish American story is, you know, obviously a little microcosm of the greater white American story in one way, where there is this kind of fear recently that, you know, white will eventually be minority. You know, I don't have to tell you all the different talking points on the news. And so this idea that, and, you know, you've heard people say that white privilege is a problematic term because not everybody that's white is privileged in the sense that they're wealthy or they're, you know, but there's a difference between, like the Irish in the 19th century, you know, when they were discriminated against because they were Catholic. It might not have been a colour thing, but there was different forms of discrimination. The white privilege label today means more than just money. It means that, you know, you can walk through a Macy's and not be kind of followed around, you know, or all of these different privileges that you get just because you're white moving through a society that favours whiteness. And so the Irish have kind of melted into that a little bit. But you know, to your point, Peter,
in the 19th century, because WASP, it's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And the great division in European history was not race until the 17th century. It was religion. And I think modern historians tend to overlook just how powerful that religious feeling was. That, you know, it powered wars for 2 centuries. It was the basis of English colonialism, was Protestantism. Catholics were ruled out of that. And, you know, colonialism, before the Jamestown plantation, is the Ulster plantation. This suppression of people, not just on race, but on religion, and they're seen as totally different people, innately dishonest and disloyal. And that kind of gets right, I think.
Yeah. Well, the language applied to the Irish, the Celts, you know, as you said, during the Ulster plantation, is exactly the language that's applied later on here when they come and they meet Indigenous people here. You know, it's very funny.
Part of Terry's book on Tammany is the Irish don't assimilate. You know, they don't become white. They set up a parallel society in America. They're the only ethnic. They create their own college system. I went to grammar school, high school, college, and graduate school in the Bronx, just in Catholic schools. We had two Catholic colleges, a Catholic university, 50 parochial schools, 3 high schools. We lived apart from, to the extent we could, from Protestant society. And they did that in every city they went to. They created a parallel society. And that was initially the rejection that they suffered, but it was self-segregation. They were going to come into America on their own terms. And it really lasted until the 1960s, the self-segregation of the Irish. Marrying Protestants was out of the picture. You had to be married in the sacristy. Everything, parochial schools, Catholic hospitals, Catholic universities, Catholic sodalities. The thing was to keep the Irish together. And of course, it was all about organization. Tammany was an organization. The Catholic Church was an organization. The unions were an organization. And the unions stayed as Irish as they could. You know, they were not, they were bigoted against anybody who wasn't Irish, including Italians and anybody else who tried to get, because it was what, you know, ourselves alone in a way. The religion was dominated by Irish, and Machine Maid tells a story of politics.
Yeah, Terry, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I do. One of the things that that Peter touched on so brilliantly is this idea of religious difference and why that is often ignored. But I would say even by historians today, and the example I can give you is that, I mean, although I'm aged, I'm fairly new to the graduate school experience. I was in graduate school as recently as 11 years ago. And I remember being in a seminar room where I dared to say that, well, we were talking about the politics of the 1920s. And I said, well, and the rise of the second Klan. And I said, and it was interpreted through a racial lens. I said, well, historically, that's actually not true. You see, I could say that because I didn't care, right? But if you were a young graduate student, you wouldn't say that, which gets to a whole nother thing about what you can say and what you can't. Because I didn't really give a damn, I said, if you look at the record, the reason the second Klan came into existence is because of the rise of power of Catholics and their allies, the Jews. Mm-hmm. And people were appalled that because it was a religious thing, right? That the Klan was not just about white supremacy, it was about Protestant supremacy, and even a particular kind of Protestant supremacy. Mm-hmm. Well, there was a great deal of pushback, particularly from the professor, whose name I remember, but I will not say. And he said at one point, so I said, well, I mean, don't you understand that, the Klan organized against Al Smith in 1924 and again in 1928, somewhat to a lesser extent, but still, because he was Catholic. And the professor said, no, that can't be. It was probably because they considered him a traitor to whiteness. Mm-hmm. I said, okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the New Deal. Right? Because that conversation was going nowhere. But it indicated to me what Peter has just said, that historians, most of whom tend to be, sort of secular and progressive, woke even, they don't want to deal with the so important difference of religion, except to the extent that, obviously, we know that Muslims are discriminated against. That sort of, religious difference is important. But the difference among Christians, mm-hmm. they don't want to go near that. Mm-hmm. And that's our experience. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. It's that terrible book that's so popular still, How the Irish Became White, by Noel Ignatieff, about he has no sense of religion, that this was, they came and the draft riots made them white. It's so off the mark that it's very popular, that because it's the sense that religion didn't matter, they were white. Mm-hmm. There was a group that arrived in America who were white the day they stepped off the boat. Mm-hmm. There was no resistance to them coming, an Irish group called Scot Irish. The immigration to the United States in the 18th century was all from Ulster and Protestant. So those Irish were white the minute. There was no problem. They went to the frontier. 7 American presidents descend from them. Didn't become a problem until Irish Catholics arrived in the 1840s. That Irishness became a problem. Hadn't been a problem up to that point. Mm-hmm. And it was a matter of religion, not color. And it stayed that way for a long time. I think one of the things about Kennedy's election in 1960 is, it was like synchronicity. That's what Young called it, was some things happened. The Vatican Council and Kennedy. Catholicism became less threatening. Kennedy, the White House, he didn't look like Thomas Nance ate people. He looked better looking than the WASP. And that was the end. Religion kind of faded out of the picture then. So when looking back at history, people say, oh, religion was not that important. Mm-hmm. But Kennedy, if he had been defeated, I don't know, I think Catholics would have gone into a swoon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I agree with you definitely about Ignatieff's book. I think there's a much better, more nuanced book called The Wages of Whiteness by Roediger, David Roediger. It's slightly more nuanced argument. So which brings us to an interesting.
Sometimes the wages of whiteness weren't a living wage.
Right. Yeah. And and I think different people. He presents the choices that people made and stuff. What I was going to say too was, look at religion today, I guess, is kind of coming to the fore a little bit, but it's to do maybe with the evangelical vote. And so do you think that's going to bring some of this back, or will historians kind of re-look at things? There's been a hard push from the right in terms of evangelical Christians.
Right.
So I don't know.
If you look at the 20s, well, first of all, evangelical Christian movement, has been written about by the likes of H.L. Mencken, right? And Sinclair Lewis, right? They've been a force in American politics for a really long time. Now, arguably, I guess they're better organized than they were in the 1920s, although I'm not entirely sure about that. But there's always been an evangelical Christian vote, if you will, a bloc, part of our culture. And I imagine it will continue to be. I mean, there's no sign that I'm not a scholar on this, but I don't know that there's any sign that evangelical Christianity is fading away in the same way that, say, Catholicism is in Ireland, for example. So they're going to be a force to be reckoned with. But I don't know this. Peter may know it better than I, which wouldn't be the first time. But it's certainly possible that I don't know that evangelical Christians regard Catholics as the enemy in the way they did 100 years ago. Peter, do you think?
No, they don't at all. In fact, there's there's a real kind of unity between the two of them. And the latest Supreme Court judge, whose name is escaping me,
Amy Barrett.
Yeah, she's a member of an evangelical group within the Catholic Church. Yeah. And the whole right wing of the Catholic Church is very hard to distinguish from evangelicals. They are united, where in the 1920s they would have been mortal enemies.
Yeah, yeah.
And they were much more, interested in converting Catholics. I don't see that. And the right wing,
the proselytizing is gone.
Back, the movement back fundamentalism, Catholic fundamentalism is the Latin Mass, and
that Tridentine stuff. Yeah.
But I think I'm not sure if that's going anywhere in the long term.
Well, you would think in terms of the Catholic aspect of this right-wing push, I think that's a very small minority. Terry touched on it there. Like, there's a huge disconnect in Ireland between, the population and the church. And obviously Ireland, was 100 years of complete dominance, absolute intersection, between the government, we'll say, and the running of the state through these different church-run institutions. And so I wonder, if that will eventually filter down. The institution is kind of moving at a glacial pace, whereas maybe the Pope is a bit more progressive. But, Irish people voted to accept, marriage equality. We now have divorce. They're allowing abortion. I think these are features of a society that are going to become more in debate. And I guess, Catholics will have to kind of struggle with where their faith begins and ends in terms of, personal kind of private, what are now political choices. So maybe that will happen in America for Irish Catholics.
I think it has. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, both my children went to Jesuit universities, and I spent a lot of money sending them there. They're both Catholic Church.
Well, maybe you should have sent them to Catholic universities instead.
I mean, we were raised to think of ourselves. I mean, the church was such a part of my life growing up that I'm still a practicing Catholic, but I have to say I'm the only one in my family who is. It's not even a deny. It's not a antagonistic. It's just they're onto something else. It's looking for
which then raises questions of I'm sorry, Peter.
Go ahead.
Well, that then raises questions of, and you've touched on this a million times too, that raises questions of identity for the Irish of the 21st century here in America, right? Yeah. Without the church, without the labor unions, which were so much a part, without the parish as an organizing principle, where do we go from here? And I think the Irish government is very concerned about this too.
Well, the one thing is that there's much more of an interest in Irish culture than there was as the religion made. More Irish Americans look at the culture of Ireland, how vibrant it is. And there's even, Irish writing. There aren't a lot of, supposedly Irish love to write, but it's hard to think of any writer in the 19th century of any consequence, early 20th century, who's Irish beyond Eugene O'Neill. You can think of some books, but none of them are like American classics the way so many others are. The Jewish literature, American literature is just chock full of writers, but it's now you have, Elizabeth Cullinan, and you have William Kennedy, Alice McDermott, an examination of Irish life that isn't just about the Catholic Church. That's, that it examines the separate culture, but it looks to the past now. It's not really about what's going on now. It's more what went on, because it was never really written about. That Irish society it was not self-described. It was not writers coming out of the Irish experience to describe Irish America, because that was, omerta was the Irish code. My mother was always, we had a woman, Elizabeth Cullen, she wrote a really good novel, A House of Gold, and she lived right by Parkchester. And my mother was horrified that she wrote this book. And she knew the family. She said, how could anybody do this to the family?
Oh my God, yeah.
And she lived, my brother and I are both writers. Her mortal fear was we'd write about the family.
Oh God, yeah.
I reveal a family secret. I just say, Mom, forgive me.
Yeah. That's kind of incredible,
It was such a strong, separate culture, but it was not a self-examining culture that was trying to explain itself to the world. It was about getting on. It was about jobs and job security. It's why the civil service with Irish people, Americans, was kind of semi-religious organization,
Yeah.
My father was always, take a test. He was a lawyer, but he thought we should become, so he was very happy when I became a court officer. He supported the family. It was very basic kind of thing. Catholic
good pensionable job.
Having gone to Manhattan College, I had guys in my class became firemen. It was no disgrace to go to college and get a civil service job, where today it would be like, what the hell? John's son got a degree and became a fireman. It was a perfectly respectable thing to do, or become a cop. I remember Louis Latham, he was the editor of the Harper's, and he said he met the class drunk 5 years later, and he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. 5 years later, and he was a sergeant at the Transit Authority.
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of the path, Timothy Marr, one of the historians, has written about that, like this communal loyalties, that Irish are not necessarily kind of individually, I guess the word he'd use is ambitious, that it's more about getting a good job and being able to get your kids on that ladder, sort of thing. And so then I suppose, it is down to, as you said, like the culture. I think a lot of people travel to Ireland now, maybe more than, in the 1950s. Ireland certainly is quite dependent on tourism, so how do we keep those links, or is it worth, like Peter, you mentioned earlier on, your grandchildren are, American, is this something that we think we're going to try to keep going? Like, here we are in the business of the Irish American Heritage Museum. Will we exist in 30 years' time,
It's anybody's guess, I think. Try to talk about 30 years from now. It's like, forget about it. 30 years ago, who ever thought, we'd be where we are now, that we'd be recovering from a Trump presidency? If you want to make a fool of yourself, predict what's going to happen in 30 years.
Yeah.
Well, I think that I think that institutions like the museum and some of the Irish Arts Center in New York, are trying to tap into what is universal about the Irish American experience, which I think would be really important. Programming that doesn't seem parochial is probably a key as well. Examining things like the intersection between the Irish and other groups, talking about race. I think that if we can keep the Irish conversation relevant to 21st century issues, then I think, we
have a chance.
We have a chance.
Yeah.
But does that translate into Irish Americans in their 20s now looking to Ireland and say, well, I want to go to Ireland. I want to examine my roots. That, as Peter says, I'm not going to predict that. I do know that when my children, actually it's been 10 years now, we went to Ireland in 2012, which is hard for me to believe. But I know that they came away from that experience when they visited their grandfather's house. They came away saying, oh, wow, this is part of who I am. So that bringing young people to Ireland might also be a way to keep the tradition alive.
I don't know. I think what Terry touched on is very true. Growing up in New York in the 50s, there were no Irish cultural institutes. There was the American Irish Story Society, which was a kind of private dining club. We didn't really have anything to do with it. Now you have the Irish Rep, which is one of the most respected independent theaters in America. You have the Irish Art Center on 11th Avenue, this multi-million-dollar examination. You have Ireland House at NYU, Glucksman. You have, academic arts. And maybe that's part of the church's decline, that there is this cultural fluorescence which didn't exist before. And again, it's an attachment to the culture now, rather than as the religion fades, there is an interest in Irish writing, Irish music, Irish movies, and I think there's more and more of a cross seeding between, Colin Tobin writes Brooklyn, he teaches at Columbia. There's more of an intellectual movement. Paul Muldoon is the poetry editor of the New Yorker. Didn't seem possible 30 years ago, that there would be that Irish influence.
Yeah,
and
on mainstream culture.
The one thing is, my daughter went to Boston College, my son went to Fordham. There is an interest, there's an academic element that didn't exist. I had to go to Fordham to be with Morris O'Connell, but there was no Irish studies program. I kind of created my own.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the things, and Terry touched on it too. Certainly, it's part of the mission of the museum is to talk about the Irish American story as part of the wider experience of American. Like that being an immigrant is a universal almost experience here. As you said, the intersectionality, and the fact that Ireland is changing. Like our most watched talk out of the year that we did talks online because of Brexit or because of COVID was Brexit. And the second most important is the soda bread baking demonstration. So, and actually the history of Black people in Ireland is, so people are not particularly interested in, what you might think they're interested in. They are interested in current affairs, and recipes, but current affairs, I think, especially, and a different kind of Ireland. I think people are sick of the quiet men. They're looking for what is universal, and what if I'm only 1/8 Irish? What else, can that speak to?
I think it's interesting because Ireland it existed so long in the shadow of the British Isles, and now it's more connected to America and Europe than England.
Yeah.
And it's a much richer culture for that reason, and self-expressive. And I think there's a lot to happen still, and we don't know where that fermenting will lead.
Yeah.
So, in 30 years, people might be saying, well, they couldn't foresee this renewal of Irish American interest and this. I remember when I spent a semester at University College Galway, and in 1977, and there was among some of the teachers, there was this real disdain for Irish Americans.
Oh, the plastic caddies coming home for their heritage.
And I was standing in front of a bar on O'Connell Street, and the Irish band from the fire department came in kills, and these kids, students I was with, were laughing. I said, you really don't have the right to laugh at them. Their families left in the famine. They couldn't stay here. And this is their attempt to stay connected to the culture. And it's not something to laugh at. It's something uniquely human of wanting
to want to belong.
Who I am. And it's just, but there was that contempt in Ireland, I have to say, Irish America.
Well,
as the war in Central America, it was, I said, you like we are always dealing with stereotypes. These are just stereotypical. Irish America is not this one-dimensional, you think.
Yeah. But Peter, I think some of the same, we must forget and kind of move on was happening in Ireland. I think there was probably a huge sense of guilt, that a family couldn't sustain all the members, and so children as young as 15 forced to emigrate, kind of thing. I wonder, was there that kind of psychological issue, even though it was coming out as kind of a disdain there? We lost contact with members of our family, that immigrated in the 1920s even. My own grandfather's brothers and sisters went to America and Australia, and it was very rarely that letters were written, or maybe to their mother, but then when the mother passed, my granddad wasn't writing letters, and so it's the tenuous connections, I think lead to a sort of a guilt, maybe. Terry, did you know your family in Ireland? Your grandfather, yeah.
Yeah. And as I said, I had we've gone to where he was born in Bundoran, in County Donegal. My closest connection to the immigrant experience is really through my wife, whose father was born in Cove. And we, as I mentioned before, we visited the house he grew up in. And my wife and my 2 children are citizens of Ireland. And I just haven't gotten around to doing it myself because I would be eligible as well. But my wife's paperwork was much easier to find. My family, we hide stuff. We don't
keep it in a safe place.
Right. But I do have to say, when I did all the paperwork to make sure that my children had Irish passports and were Irish citizens, people thought, oh, isn't that sentimental? No, actually, it was quite practical because I thought first of all, this means that you can work in Europe should you ever want to. And increasingly in the United States today, I think, okay, well, it could be a place to go, get away from it all.
Yeah. Even after 9/11, there was a huge upsurge, people not wanting to travel on American passports, yeah.
That's right.
The records of their coming and goings were very scattered. Because of this genealogy, I've been able to put something together. But my grandfather, Patrick Quinn, was from Tipperary. He was a labor leader. He became president of Central Federated Union of New York City. And my father said as a kid on Lower East Side, he and his brother were never in their bedroom because somebody was always coming over. They would bring somebody over. And if anybody started to talk about Ireland to my grandfather, the old countries, you liked it? Why don't you go back?
Oh, God.
He didn't want to hear anything about how life was in the old countries. Well, you don't like it, get on the ship, go back. That was the attitude.
I know, yeah.
We're going to deal with labor unions, and that's history, ancient history, and it was unpleasant, and I'm glad I'm out of there.
Yeah. Well, my own aunt is in North Dakota since the 60s. She didn't originally come to North Dakota, but she ended up there, and definitely, she does not look back at Ireland with rose-tinted glasses. She doesn't miss it. She's only visited about 5 times, I think, in my lifetime, and even, you would say like leaving a technically Ireland in the modern era, it probably wasn't all that modern, but, she as a young woman initially and now as a 70-year-old, she doesn't miss Ireland, I don't think.
I was the first person in my family to go back. They started in the 1840s and they finished. Everybody bought somebody out. So by the 1880s, they were through. Nobody ever talked about going back. I went back just to see.
I had to force my father-in-law to go back to Cove in 1991. I guess, well, he was younger than I am now, but he was probably in his early 60s. I mean, he really had no desire to go back. For him, he left when he was about 4 or 5, having seen his mother bury his older brother, and the father was already here in New York. He had absolutely no desire to go back to Ireland. He really just kind of did it to shut me up, which is generally a good
good practice.
One thing is like, I think one of the hopeful signs is I've always thought Bill Kennedy, the way he put Albany Irish on the literary map. People are going to be studying. It's like what Joyce did with Dublin, convention to be a European city, and he made it an international capital. And I think if Irish American writers can come along and tell their story like that, then it will survive. It's literature that survives, and movies and art. It's not. People can talk about movies in the 40s. Ask them who the governor of New York was in 1944. They can't tell you. But they can talk about Jimmy Cagney movies.
We can.
Yeah. But that's right. They can talk about Jimmy Cagney. Yeah.
What do you think of that Seltzer impeachment, by the way? That was pretty
Peter and I sometimes have conversations that only about 3 people in New York can have. And this is one of them. But another institution in Albany, which is doing great work, not just for the Irish, but through literature, examining the human experience, is the Writers Institute at the University of Albany, which I'm happy to say that I'm a member of. I mean, they do some really wonderful work. And as I said, it's very multicultural, it's very diverse. Yeah. But when I see the kinds of people who are speaking there, and I think this is how you keep the culture alive.
Well, and I think, that has been, one of you touched on it a minute ago, particularly like in light of Northern Ireland, that was kind of the hope, since the Good Friday Agreement, was this connection that we had with Europe. And so young, Northern Irish people, regardless of their religion, could call themselves European, and it kind of took away the stigma of being, an Anna or a Bridget, and knowing which side of the wall you belonged on. And I think that's kind of the danger now for Northern Ireland with Brexit and the protocol and all of that. But the other side of it is that we've had 20 years of peace. And so, hopefully this generation that have grown up without knowing violence You know, and the Irish government seems to want to step in there too, like they're allowing the Erasmus program, for instance, you know, continue for kids in Northern Irish universities so that they can study abroad as Europeans for a semester. You know, I think those are kind of hopeful signs, and absolutely the culture, you know, it is what we do at the museum, you know, is I've always said it, you know, we're not just a museum in terms of dusty relics in glass cases. Like we're trying to share culture and heritage, and that's why it's so important to have talks like this with you guys, but also, as I say, these panels that we have on Brexit or other issues, you know, that touch on kind of modern Ireland and modern Irish America.
You know, when I was in Ireland in the 70s, people thought you were out of your mind if you brought up Northern Ireland. It was,
yeah,
that's like, forget about it. Don't have anything to do. It's crazy Americans who are feeling it. And now it's really interesting because Ireland is really connected to world culture, to Europe and America. And it's the Northern Irish who at one time were part of an empire who are now totally alone.
Yeah.
The English governor's not loyal to them. They have no outside connections. And,
Yeah.
you know, I feel sorry for them. They're going to have to be kind of smoothed away for them to get out of the blind alley they're in now of no surrender. And they're just boxed in. They have nowhere to go. They have nobody outside of Northern Ireland is really interested in.
Which is the lesson they didn't learn 100 years ago. You know, we just had the partition kind of centenary last year, and it's very, as you said, like they were part of an empire then, and even then they were kind of on the side. You know, it suited unionist politicians in England, in the Conservative Party, you know, to hold the balance of power by using them, but beyond that there was no kind of credence given to their needs or their desires at all, you know. And so they've just been kind of let down one after the other, I think, throughout the last 100 years. But the DUP are so entrenched, you know, that it's hard to get a kind of a dialogue going.
Battle, they're losing the political battle. They have no constituency in England anymore. From what you know, Brexit is English nationalism. It's not British nationalism.
Yeah. So, guys, I think on that note, how did you celebrate or how will you celebrate St. Patrick's Day? Do either of you march anymore?
I always march, but I've had problems walking, so I won't be. But I always march with Manhattan College.
Oh, good.
We meet for lunch afterwards in an Italian restaurant. We don't have to be around.
Good. Well, you know.
My sister-in-law, whose family is from Skibbereen, she always cooks an Irish dinner. So
nice, good.
I'll probably do something similar. We have a million different parades in New Jersey that I could go to, and I sometimes go to one or two. And what I like about them, though, is that I mean, talk about inclusive. I mean, anyone who wants to march in the West Orange St. Patrick's Day parade is welcome to come. So you're looking at it, and it's clearly a St. Patrick's Day parade, but it's clearly not just Irish people marching, which actually is more and more true of the St. Patrick's Day parade. When you look at the high schools that are marching.
Irish America, St. Patrick's Day was always about immigration. It was always about America, asserting Irish presence in America. You know, people would come from Ireland. They were stunned at but it was an ethnic assertion, and it was an immigrant assertion. And Terry said it's losing that edge. It's becoming like Cinco de Mayo or what's the reason for people to party?
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody about this last week.
I don't have any problem with that.
Well, you know, celebration is good, but I think you're right. You know, that it was, you know, historically it was this display of, like, you know, we could be a voting bloc if you treated us right. We have this many workers, and just, you know, I'm always amazed at, like, the formality of the New York parade. All of these soldiers and sanitation workers and cops, you know, and it's very much an assertion of kind of power.
You know, my father used to take me to the St. Patrick's Day parade. He was a politician, would go to the reviewing stand. I remember, like, about 1959, I looked, I said, I don't think this parade is going to be around much longer. Everybody in it is about 70. And it's this tremendous revival where, you know.
Well, and the Emerald Societies, as you said, you know, anyone can be a member, you know,
Societies and schools, even, you know, NYU Glucksman Island House marches. Now, if you said 50 years ago.
Yeah. But NYU.
It's been a house marching the St. Patrick's Day parade. Not many people would have predicted that.
Yeah. So we've, you know, I guess that's the answer. We've come a long way, and hopefully we'll continue going. But I like that Irish America, you know, I hope has become more inclusive. I think it's important that we do share that story, and as Peter, you touched on it earlier on, like the difficulties that, you know, they had as a group in the 19th century, those are transferable stories, you know, and so that's, I think, what's important for our story, is that it is a universal one here, and that we should be able to empathize, you know, with other groups, these
Elizabeth,
refugees.
what's your feeling running the museum? Do you know, we could end on this. What's your feeling about Irish America, running an Irish American Institute in the capital of New York State?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, it is not without its challenges at times, that I suppose, you know, on the face of it, you are looking at an aging, you know, kind of membership, and as each generation goes by, a more tenuous link. But I think, you know, given what we do, which is now more than just the museum, like we have a lot of robust programming and things, I think that that is where the future lies, you know, that to try to make sense of the experience, to try to learn from it, and to try to basically to teach empathy. Like, you know, as I was saying, that if you were a refugee in the 1840s, you have an awful lot in common with people from Syria today, you know, and so that's, I think, where we're trying to show, you know, like, why did they flee, you know, how do they flee, who's fleeing today, and I think that if we can make those connections, it'll be a better country for all of us, you know, without losing sight of our own uniqueness, of course.
You got the Irish American governor to come to you?
Well, yeah, I met her before she was governor, you know, so we do a lot with the American Irish Legislators Society, kind of founded the museum, actually. So we have, you know, still the political ties here in Albany. But, you know, it is interesting, like, and of course they have much bigger fish to fry than a museum. But I think what Terry said was important, like, you know, us in the Irish Arts Centre and Irish Rep, you know, we are something that the Irish government certainly is aware of, you know, having a foothold here in America, and this kind of soft diplomacy that we're capable of doing, I think is very important, you know. So from that point of view, we'll continue, you know, certainly for the next 30 years. But yeah, it's interesting, you know, it is interesting. I'm kind of hopeful most of the time, especially in March. Everyone is excited in March. So we just have to make hay while the sun shines, and then try and tell them that we're here all year, you know. But did we leave anything out? Did either of you have anything else to say? I would recommend all of your writings. I just have to say that Banished Children of Eve is a beautiful book. Looking for Jimmy, you know, if you're looking for just little essays that you can pick up and put down. And then Terry, I think your work on Machine Made and Al Smith, absolutely amazing. And you've got about 7 other books. I haven't listed them all.
You made one of the most important revisionist histories over the past.
Yeah. And you know, it is interesting because, excuse me, revisionism sometimes gets a bad name, but I think, Terry, what you did for Tammany, you know, is amazing. And you know, if you want to actually very quickly speak to that, I'm sorry, we should have brought this in earlier, just in terms of, you know, social welfare and immigrants' rights and all of that.
Well, I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, most of what I learned very early on about Tammany's other side is from Peter, which is why that book is dedicated to Peter, actually. Yeah. And I didn't even mean that as a joke. But it's, you know, Tammany's golden age was in a period where if you fell down on the job and you were hurt, lots of luck, fella, right? Or lady, right? Yeah, Al Smith's mother had to go out and try to keep her family together because there was no social welfare net when live television. There's no social welfare net when Al Smith was a child, right? That all changed thanks to Tammany Hall.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, one final thing, if you can hear me over the dog.
We can.
He doesn't like the mailman.
Oh, poor
that the progressive today should learn the lesson of Tammany, that, you know, you have to get a practical connection. You can't just have these ideals if you don't have the practical. The thing that made progressivism part of the American history and success, as Terry points out in his book, is the practical politics of Tammany. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an element of practicality missing among today's progressives. They don't.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, you know, people
talked about defunding the police. They would have talked about getting people jobs on the police. You know? Yeah. Okay, you vote, we'll get you jobs on the police. So. Yeah.
And widening the kind of circle, like that's, I think that is important. Tammany did so much great work, you know, in terms of even the after the Triangle Factory fire, and they, you know, you never think about them in terms of that.
You know, Machine Made makes an important point about the Irish weren't a majority. They were an ethnic minority, and they still they're the ones who politicized, like Jews, Italians. They took them. They didn't care who they were registering at the polls.
Yeah.
They came and voted.
Yeah, yeah. And they went into their districts, whoever, as you say, the tenants in the building, you know, they weren't all Irish. And so, yeah, you got to mobilize the vote.
Plunkett is talking about one of the captains on the Lower East Side. He said he didn't care if he took his hat off in church or pulled it over his ears in a synagogue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No,
the practicality of Plunkett and those was very commendable.
And Plunkett going down and talking to Italian janitors on Wall Street. That was not, the reformers were not talking to Italian janitors.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's it. There's an element, I think, too, of, you know, talk about privilege, of blind spots when we talk about progressivism, maybe, you know, that, yeah, they would do well to, as you said, get on the practicality side of things.
My computer's about to lose power. So.
I know. So guys, thank you so much. This was absolutely fabulous. I think, you know, a well-deserved look at Irish American, where we are in this Irish American Heritage Month. Highly recommend all of their books. We have some copies in the store, but of course you can buy them at your local bookstore as well. And I want to thank both Terry and Peter and wish you both a happy St. Patrick's Day, and we will be in touch again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for